There he goes again. That's huge. That's on the roof.
Welcome to Dean at Stumps, the cricket encyclopedia.
The Sri Lankans are stunned. The Zimbabweans are jubilant. Look what that means to them. The first ever series victory against Sri Lanka.
Don't you just enjoy the whoops and yells and yelps of excitement by the Zimbabwe cricket team back in 2017? And many people wonder whether, or when, should I say, we will be hearing such exclamations again. Hello and welcome to the Dean at Stumps podcast. I'm Dean Duplessis. It's great to be with you. And if you've been listening to the Dean at Stumps podcast for the last couple of weeks, you'll know that we've been taking things back in time a little. So we've had some wonderful current interviews throughout the year, but sometimes as we approach the end of the year, it's nice just to go back in time a little, isn't it? Whether it's in the year or, as we want to do slightly differently this time round, is to go way back in time, 23 years, to be honest, because that's when the England team embarked on their first and up to now own tour of Zimbabwe, which included test matches. So they've been back since then to play a couple of one-day series, but this was the one and only time that England played two test matches in Zimbabwe. But of course, it was England who should have won that first test match down in Bulawayo, but some cunning bowling at the end ensured that that test match actually ended in a tie. Well, it was probably a draw, but the scores were level. And then, of course, Zimbabwe probably should have won the second test match, but England dodged the bullet rather nicely due to the fact that heavy rains came down, as is normally the case around about that late December, early January period in this part of the world. So a draw was the outcome. However, there was no draw in the one-day series because Zimbabwe won that series by 3-0, which meant that they completed a whitewash over England, and obviously that was certainly got the cat amongst the pigeons. So you remember that we've spoken to Alistair Campbell, and he spoke not only about the Alistair Campbell High Performance Program, but he also spoke about his time remembering his time as captaining the team. And one of the highlights was, of course, that 3-0 series win by Zimbabwe over England. You remember that last year we spoke to Ed O'Brandis, who took a hat-trick and actually bowled very nicely throughout that series. So we thought that now this time round we do need to speak to somebody who was incredibly influential, but probably was a little behind the scenes and didn't quite get the recognition he deserved, in my humble opinion. And that, of course, is former Test captain and now Derbyshire coach Dave Houghton. So Dave had a rather unique situation, because when he took over as coach after John Hampshire's stint in 1996, not only was Houghton still a player, but he was a player coach as well, a rather unique situation that Zimbabwe found themselves in. And one of the things that Houghton had to adjust to and found it rather interesting was to ensure that he gave Alistair Campbell his space as captain, that he also focused on his game, but that he also had to coach the team. So a rather unique situation that Dave Houghton found himself in. So how did he adapt to doing all of that?
The difficulty that I had with being player coach was not being captain, because you then have a difficulty with where your authority stops and the captain's authority takes over. And basically, Alistair was in his primary years as a captain. He was a decent captain and a good leader of the side. And we had to come to agreement that I ran everything up to the edge of the white line, and as soon as we crossed that white line, it would become the captain's responsibility. So with that in mind, we actually then worked as quite a good partnership throughout that little tenure. But it was a very exciting series, and of course, the fact that we beat England, you know, it doesn't matter what cricket country you come from, everybody wants to beat England because we all know that the game started here.
And I mean, obviously, there was some incredibly good, there was some banter, sledging, whatever you'd like to call it, after that first test match down in Bulawayo, where David Bumble Lloyd, obviously that famous quote of his when he said, "We flipping murdered them." Did that inspire you to come out even harder at England for the second test match and for the remainder of the one-day series?
I wouldn't say it really inspired us. I mean, it was just a culmination of events at the time. I have had many conversations with Bumble since then, and one of the things I always say to him was, actually, you were right, you did murder us in that game, but sadly the result shows that the game was tied. It is quite interesting also over here that people do well remember that test match, and they remember, of course, Bumble's quotes.
Yeah.
but they never ever mentioned the second test, which was the one in Harare where we were all over them and it rained for 3 days. So we were in a great position to win that second test, and it rained and we never got a chance to put that to bed. But we had a very big psychological edge over them from that game, and also from the game, if you remember, Dean, where we played Mashonaland against the England side, a 4-day game, and we beat them in 2.5 days.
Yes.
With the help of one of their own players, Jimmy Kirtley.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. You had a part to play. You scored a blistering 110 in the first innings of that 4-day game as well. I remember that well. And Gary Brent, who was a young up-and-coming medium pacer, bowled very nicely, taking 4 wickets. As you say, Jimmy Kirtley, who then went on to play a test match or two for England many years later, probably past his prime, but even so, had a part to play in that as well. And suddenly then Kirtley was one of the net bowlers for England. So it was a very interesting time that we had. But going back to that second test match, one of the things that I remember is that possibly that was one of the very few times where Zimbabwe actually had a full-strength seam bowling attack, in the sense that you had Heath Streak, Edo Brandis and Henry Olonga, 3 pretty sharpish bowlers who were capable of bowling very aggressive spells as well. And that seemed to put Zimbabwe in good stead, although Guy Whittle certainly was good in that particular test match as well. It must have been nice to finally have had all 3 fast bowlers firing at the same time. The first test match, I remember Edo twisted his ankle, so Brian Strang had to come into the side. But that second test match, being able to utilize Brandis, Streak and Olonga must have been pretty special for you as coach.
Oh, very much so. It goes back to that, the famous debate that you can have, who's more important to you, your batsmen or your bowlers? And obviously you need both. But as far as I'm concerned, if you want to compete in all cricket, you need a good bowling side. So once we could put out a decent bowling side that could bowl the opposition out on any surface, we gave ourselves a good chance to win games. And we went on to win games from there. So, yeah, it was a good bowling attack, and it was nice to go at them with a full-strength one.
And then, of course, the one-dayers was just absolutely superb. I mean, many people are, and quite rightly so, of the opinion that England were never a particularly good one-day side in the 1990s because they didn't necessarily take one-day cricket seriously, despite the fact that they got to the final of the 1992 World Cup, albeit in slightly controversial circumstances. But Zimbabwe, do you think that Zimbabwe were able to capitalize on a certain amount of complacency that England had? Or do you think that Zimbabwe took advantage of the fact that England weren't a particularly good one-day side? Or was it just Zimbabwe playing amazingly good cricket that England were not able to deal with? Because really, you outbattered, outbowled and outfielded England. All the departments, you were head and shoulders above, especially in the fielding department, you were head and shoulders above England.
I think it was a phase of cricket that England still believed that their best cricketers in Test cricket would make good one-day sides. And there was always a belief in that. If you could play Test cricket, you could adapt to one-day cricket. And England was probably the slowest of all the countries to change that philosophy around to where they are now, where they have a very specific group of people who play T20, another specific group of people who play 50 overs, and it culminated in them winning the World Cup. At that time, they just believed that their best team to play Test cricket could be adapted and would play one-day cricket. We as a better suited at one-day cricket and had been for many years. And we also were not sort of held back by any sort of having to play the textbook manual way of cricket through the MCC coaching. We had some quite innovative batsmen for that time. People like Andy Waller could whack you over cow corner in 2 seconds. We had guys who were prepared to take risks and play like that because we played so much one-day cricket and enjoyed playing it. So we were quite innovative, really. We had a decent bowling side and we had batters who could smack the ball miles. I always remember looking at that series that I always felt like they were still playing, line and length and knocking the ball into the covers. And we have in Zimbabwe quite thick outfields and they wanted to keep the ball on the ground all the time. And of course, they'd get, singles and twos where we'd be getting boundaries because we were quite happy to hit the ball in the air.
It's amazing you should say that, Dave, because Bumble Lloyd actually had a conversation with me about that, and he said that en route to New Zealand after the loss that they had against Zimbabwe, he was saying that perhaps both teams missed a trick to a certain extent, where players such as, from a Zimbabwean perspective, perhaps a Heath Streak or a Craig Evans or even an Edo Brandis could have batted up the order because there was a lot of rain around. and utilised hitting the ball over the top as opposed to trying to, get the ball through the field and trying to find the boundary like that. And perhaps maybe one or two of England players could have done the same. I'm not so sure. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, definitely from the England side, they needed to use the air more often. I thought they played too nicely on the ground and got themselves into positions. And we're talking about an era where if you got yourself behind the run rate, so you got into the last 10 overs needing 7 and 8 and over, 70 or 80 runs in the last 10 overs, the percentage chances of you winning something like that were way down, 10, 20% at most. So by them playing nicely and keeping a few wickets in hand, they got themselves into trouble. And conversely, when they tried to come out and play some shots, Edo ran through the top order. So I think it was one of those eras where we were a good one-day side and we played particularly well, particularly at home, and they weren't a great one-day side, and it showed.
Yes, it certainly did show. So that was Dave Houghton talking predominantly about the England tour, which was so successful for Zimbabwe, and the way that they were able to outplay England in the one-day matches. And now let's hear what Houghton thinks and what he's or how he speaks, should I say, about his personal career.
I think because we didn't win a lot, we were very much the minnows of the international game. Almost every victory we got as a player or as a player coach or as a coach was a big time for me. But I guess if you had to single out one particular series, then I think the getting to the Super Sixes of the World Cup around the turn of the century, probably one of my last the last big tournament I did with the guys, was probably the highlight for me.
And of course, that triangular series, both in 1997 in South Africa after the series against England, where Zimbabwe played very good cricket, beat India and ran South Africa close on a number of occasions. And then again in 2000, when you were still coach, where Zimbabwe actually beat England and beat South Africa. I would imagine that would have been two very special wins for you as well in that particular series.
Yeah, that's the thing. We used to beat good sides. We didn't just beat the minnows. We were holding our own very well, and we started to beat good sides. At that World Cup that I'm talking about, we beat India at Leicester, which was an amazing achievement. Henry Olonga, particularly at the end, cleaning up for us. And then to go on and beat South Africa at Chelmsford. They were rated as the side that was going to win the World Cup, and here we were beating them at Chelmsford. So, we won our fair share of games, but we beat good sides, and that was really impressive.
And Dave, switching our attention to the best format, in my opinion, which is Test cricket. In fact, my WhatsApp status says Test cricket is the best cricket. Again, there'd be a few things that stand out for you. I would imagine, for example, that first Test win in 1995. I remember interviewing Andy Flower, and he was talking about the way that you as a team were able to amass 544. But he said what he enjoyed the most, though, was the way that Zimbabwe hunted down those 20 wickets, because they dismissed Pakistan for cheaply, inserted the follow-on, or enforced the follow-on, and rolled them again for a second time. And he said, despite him and Grant playing so well, he loved the way that you are able to hunt down those 20 wickets and really make it incredibly difficult for Pakistan. That as a player, because John Hampshire was the coach, of course, so that for you as a player must have been, well, I can't put it into words how that must have been, you being a part of Zimbabwe's first Test win as well.
Yeah, that was a very, very special. And obviously your first win is your best one. So that was a great Test win. The two Flowers were magnificent. I think Guy Whittle got 100 as well. Yes. It was also magnificent when we batted, because don't forget we were in trouble. I know that I went in before then. Well, I went in, I think, at the fall of the second wicket when we were in deep trouble, and I think I only got 20 odd. But by the time I left, I think we were about 50 odd for 3. And, to get those runs from there was fantastic. But the thing I remember about that game more than anything, and I was part of it, I hope you don't mind me being a little bit
of course not
gloaty over this, but some of the catches we took in that game, I know I took one at first slip, jumping up in the air one-handed, and I took another one diving forward at gully in the second innings. The catch Alistair Campbell took, a couple of other catches the lads took. We were unbelievable. And it always amazes me because, there's a lot of talk over the years about match fixing, and that game comes up every now and again as one that was possibly fixed. And whenever somebody mentions that to me, I always say to them, how do you fix a match when the guys take the catches that we took in a game like that? How do you plan that beforehand? Because that was just phenomenal cricket.
But that was just something that Zimbabwe prided themselves on throughout, back in, I guess, in the time when you played, was the catching. And I know the catch you're talking about. It was a short and wide delivery by David Brain. And I'm afraid I don't remember who the batsman was. It could have been Amir Sahel, I think, who went for a full-blooded cut.
It was Amir Sahel.
Yes, and you just took this incredible catch. Not forgetting that you were dealing with a slightly damaged hand as well. That you picked up in Australia. So you were still struggling with that, took a brilliant catch. And as you said, Grant Flower, those catches in the gully that he took were incredibly special as well. So, I mean, it's incredible to see that despite the fact that Zimbabwe were... I'm not really sure that, maybe we could call them, in that particular era, the majority of the cricketers were, some people would refer to them as a bunch of talented amateurs, which I don't know if that's a very apt, and I don't know if that's correct, but that's what they were referred to as around the world. But yet they still held their catches, scored their runs, and took wickets. So you didn't necessarily always deliver the results. But what do you think made them so much more competitive back then against full-strength teams, as opposed to what the current setup sadly is in Zimbabwe, and where you don't necessarily see the consistency in terms of the competitiveness that Zimbabwe used to have 25, 26 years ago?
That's a hard one to sort of nail in a sentence, but I think there's a couple of things. I think firstly, we played a lot more cricket and a lot stronger cricket. We didn't have a lot of easy games. So every game we played was a tough encounter for us, and I think we learned from it, and we learned quite quickly from it. People say we were amateurs at the time, and we probably were pretty much amateurs because no one really got paid a great deal. Having said that, being paid doesn't make you a professional. Being a professional is the dedication to not making mistakes and not making error and learning from your mistakes. And that's where I think we were actually really good. We learned quickly on our feet. John Hampshire was a big one in that right from the beginning. He was never going to make us run around fields and do amazing strength and conditioning work and things. He was going to use the old Yorkshire way of bat, bowl and field yourself fit, and you learn the whole time you're doing it. And that's exactly what he did. And I think we were a good bunch of learners. We really were. We had young cricketers that I still, when I'm coaching nowadays, I refer back to, and I will always talk about Guy Whittle, because Guy would be, your middle-of-the-road all-rounder around the world. A lot of people would think he probably wouldn't even get into a county setup, which he might not have done. And yet the man has got, 3 or 4 test hundreds and a double test hundred. His ability to use his natural cricketing ability and turn it into something very special just is quite outstanding. And I think a lot of Zimbabweans did that. They played way above their potential.
When you took over as head coach after John Hampshire, after the 1996 World Cup, John was very good in ensuring that Zimbabwe became a test team that was recognised, I think, in the way that he was able to get batsmen to occupy the crease. But to me, it felt that when you took over, you were able to instill a bit more of flair. And so the mentality changed slightly from just occupying the crease and ensuring that test matches ended in a draw to now we actually want to go out there and we want to win test matches. Would that be a fair or slightly harsh observation?
I think it's a fair observation, but I'm not sure that I should take credit for that, because I think the credit for that really comes to the next generation of players that came through. Because, I got to the end of my generation. I was the last one from my era. And the new era of Alistair Campbell, and I think they had more of a belief in themselves and a belief in their ability. I may have helped that a little bit with some of the work I did behind the scenes as a coach, particularly in the days before we used statistical information. I certainly did quite a bit of groundwork, particularly in the tour of England, on how and where to bowl at certain players and let guys know how and where people would bowl at us.
What would be your 2 personal standout performances that you will always remember? So naturally for the observer, 142 against New Zealand in the 87 World Cup, and 266 against Sri Lanka in 94, although you said that was one of your most boring innings because of all the reverse sweeps that you played. What, in your opinion, would be the two standout innings in one day and a test match cricket that you'd say, I really took great satisfaction in the way that I was able to change, get a bit of momentum into the game, shift momentum, or, get Zimbabwe back into the game?
Well, probably for me, they wouldn't have been the international games. I know I played one really great innings on one of our tours down to South Africa. I think we had a game against Northwestern Transvaal, which was our one and only warm-up game, and we were in dire trouble. And I think I batted with Henry, and we put on over 100 at the end, and I ended up getting about 145 not out, which actually got us enough runs, and we won the game comfortably in the end. So in terms of getting sides out of trouble, that would probably be my one. But, I look back on my career with quite a bit of fondness. I would have liked to have played more one-day international cricket when I was younger, but by the time I played the majority of my one-day game, I was in my late 30s. I was probably a bit too old, so I wasn't a big fan of the one-day game. So for me, the Test 100 I got on the country's first Test match, and my debut and the country's debut, I will always remember. And, I will always remember the 266 in Bulawayo against Sri Lanka, because I didn't make a mistake over those 2 days. And that was a long time to bat. We didn't end up winning the game, although I think if it hadn't rained on the fourth day, we probably would have. But it was my standout performance and the one that I will always remember.
What about the 105 not out that you scored against New Zealand with a broken foot?
Yeah, I remember that one too, but it's it pales a little bit into insignificance when it comes to the two things that really stand out in my career, and the two things that I'm remembered for, and that is the highest Zimbabwe score and the first one to get 100.
Absolutely, and at one stage you were the first one to get, actually you had all the records at one point, the highest Zimbabwe score in both tests and one days, but that was obviously broken, and you were the first Zimbabwean to score hundreds in both one day and test match cricket. So at one point you had every record that a batsman could have had in terms of getting there first, which I'm sure it was something that, you are very modest, but I'm sure that would be something that, you would even now, after all these years, remember with a great deal of pride, because of the fact that they would have helped Zimbabwe to have got into good positions as well.
Yeah, I do remember them with pride. I have to say I look back at my time with Zimbabwe cricket with great pride. And all the time that I look at Zimbabwe cricket, I pray for them to get back to those days where they can say once again that they're a force to be challenged with in international cricket.
What a fantastic interview with a wonderful individual. Dave Houghton, bringing us to the end of this Dean at Stumps podcast. It's been great being with you. I'm going to be spending a bit of time in Australia, believe it or not, so who knows what nice delights we might pick up there in terms of interviews. It's supposed to be a holiday, but you never know what can happen in the future, do you? And of course, next year we will also continue to have more current interviews as the various domestic season and international seasons unfold as well. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast, and we'll be back next time. Until then, it's goodbye.